Hello, welcome to English Buddhist terminology. And today we'll be looking at the Buddhist term, dependent origination. Let's think about this question. What is unique about Buddhism? Or what was the truth which the Buddha became enlightened to that makes Buddhism so different from other religions? As we think about these questions, we will have to come back to a very central idea or theory, which is the theory of philosophy of dependent origination. When the Buddha became enlightened while sitting underneath the Bodhi tree, he said the following words: "How amazing! All beings in this world possess the wisdom and virtue of the Tathagata. It is just that their delusion and attachment have prevented them from attaining enlightenment." And following these words, he then said something that is related to dependent origination. And basically what he said was that everything in the world exists as a result of dependent origination. In other words, things originate depending on certain conditions. And what he was talking about is dependent origination as well as causes and conditions. And today we'll be looking at and exploring these very two important terms: dependent origination and causes and conditions. And now let's go back to dependent origination. And this idea, or we can even call it a philosophy, is very important in Buddhism. In fact, it is what makes Buddhism different from all other religions. And in fact, dependent origin is so important that it was very effective and influential in a way that it actually converted two of Buddha's most important disciples, Sariputra and Moggallana. As we know that before they took refuge in the Buddha, they were all Brahmins, practicing diligently and searching for ways to become enlightened. And one day, Sariputra was walking on the streets, and then suddenly he came across one of the Buddha's very first 5 disciples, whose name is Asvajit. And as Asvajit had already spent quite an amount of time listening to the Buddha's teachings and then practicing what he had learned, therefore he was in fact a well-cultured or well-practiced monastic. Therefore, as soon as Sariputra saw Asvajit, he was very touched by the way he presented himself, the way that the feeling that he gave to other people, a sense that gives rise to respect in other people's minds. Therefore, Sariputra approached him and asked him, "May I ask who you are, where you come from? And can you please tell me who your master is and how he had taught you, as well as what he had taught you?" Asvajit replied, "My master, or my teacher, Sakyamuni Buddha, had taught us that all phenomena arise from causes and conditions. All phenomena are obliterated by causes and conditions." If we were to go back to these words said by Asvajit, we will see that phenomena here refers to the universe. Phenomena refers to the things or the events which we come across in our lifetime. So basically, a phenomenon is a thing or a situation or event which happens in the world around us. And as for the second part of the sentence, causes and conditions, or that all phenomena arise from causes and conditions, it tells us that everything comes into existence only under the situation when a set of causes and a right set of conditions are present. Once they're present, a certain phenomena comes into being. But once this set of causes and conditions fall apart, then the phenomenon will cease to exist. That's how simple it can be. And therefore, as soon as Sariputra heard of the truth, which was just recited by Asvajit, he realized that this was what he was looking for. This was exactly the truth which he was pursuing, and that this is exactly the truth that will lead him to liberation. As soon as he realized that, he decided that Sakyamuni Buddha will be the master of his life, and that Sakyamuni Buddha will be the one who teaches him the way to attain liberation. Therefore, he quickly went back to his place, spoke to his best friend, Moggallana, and then together the two of them brought all of their disciples and went to the Buddha and took refuge in him. And this was the story of how two of the Buddha's great disciples became Buddhists. The first one is Sariputra, one best known for his wisdom, and the other, Moggallana, best known for his supernatural power. Therefore, just by looking at this story, we can see how important causes and conditions, as well as dependent origination, may be. And these two theories are in fact the very core idea that underlies all phenomena in the universe. And now let us look at what dependent origination is. And if I was to give you a very simple explanation of what it is, or to try to describe what it is in simple words, I can tell you that when we talk about dependent origination, we're also saying that no thing and no phenomena arises out of nothing. And secondly, I can also tell you that no thing and no phenomena can exist alone by itself. In other words, which is point number 3, I can say that the right conditions must come together before this phenomena can arise and come into existence. Just like the quote from the Lankavatara Sutra says, phenomena do not arise independently. They arise dependent on each other. And in many of the Buddhist sutras, you will be able to find a lot of similar quotations, once again proving the importance of dependent origination, as well as causes and conditions, which underlies all other philosophy and theories of Buddhism. And let's now go into greater detail on discussing dependent origination as well as cause and conditions. I must begin by telling you that dependent origination depends on causes and conditions. Just like what we have said before, nothing is an independent existence. So one thing has to rely on the right set of causes and conditions in order to exist. Therefore, we can also say that everything does not have a self that is separate from other things. And thirdly, there is no absolute phenomena anywhere in the universe. In other words, like what I have just said before, once the causes and conditions fall apart, and then this phenomenon will no longer exist because the conditions that makes its existence are no longer there. Therefore, it's not there. So once again, that's why the Buddha tells us, all phenomena arise from causes and conditions. And all phenomena are obliterated by causes and conditions. In Chinese, it tells us, 诸法因缘生, 诸法因缘灭. So this exists, therefore that exists. This is absent, therefore that is absent, and so on. And we'll look at this into greater detail in a later stage. And let's now go back to the first point, which I was just talking about, which tells us that no thing can exist on its own. Or, to be exact, nothing is an independent existence. And what exactly do I mean by this? And let me try to use a more life-related example to explain this to you. If we were to look at a table, do we call it a table? Is it really a table? And how does this table come into existence? If we were to look into this question, then of course we will have to look at what the kind of material which makes a table. Therefore, we see a table, we realize that a table is made of wood. Now, we'll be thinking about the next question. Then what is wood? Okay, a table comes from wood. Where does wood come from? We know that wood comes from tree, or a tree. So a tree grows. It grows big and strong, and then we chop it down to provide wood that makes a table, so that the table can be something which we use in our everyday life. And now there's the table, there's the wood, there's also the tree. What about the tree? Where does the tree come from? You may tell me that a tree comes from a seed. Okay, so we have the table, the wood, the tree, the seed. And now, what about the seed? Where does the seed come from? Of course, we can go all the way back to the origin of this existence. And let's put that aside now. What I'm trying to say is that in order for a table to exist, we will have to have the right conditions. What are the right conditions? There has to be wood. And of course, in order for wood to be there, a tree has to grow well and strong. And in the process, of course, we'd hope that a tree has been planted in a good environment where it receives plenty of sunshine, water, and it receives or absorbs plenty of nutrients from the soil and so on in order for it to become a tree. So these are all the conditions which a table has to depend on in order to become existence. Let me give you another example. Who are you? Where do you come from? And you could look at yourself and say, I come from my parents. My parents are those who gave birth to me. Okay, so your parents will be one of the conditions that gives you your existence. What about your parents? Keep going back. Your parents come from your grandparents. And your grandparents come from your great-grandparents and so on. So these are a set of conditions that have to be present in order for you to be living in this world, sitting there, breathing, sitting in front of the computer, thinking and learning today. In other words, you, the existence, has to depend on the conditions of all your parents, your grandparents, and so on. So you cannot say that you are independent. You cannot say that you're an independent existence, because that's not exactly how you came into existence. So, in other words, when we talk about how nothing can exist on its own, we're saying that one thing is deeply related to many others. And now, after giving you very simple explanations of dependent origination, as well as causes and conditions, well, I have to go back to the point where I talked about how these are the theories that makes Buddhism different from others. And how exactly are they different from others? We can compare the Buddhist way of looking at this world with what we call worldly knowledge, or scholastic inquiry and knowledge. As we look at these two different points of view, we will see that scholastic inquiry basically gives explanations of appearances. For example, it gives an interpretation of things based on the name and form of these phenomena or these things. So you would say that this is a table, it has a name of a table. And what is its function? What does it look like? And so on. But Buddhism, on the other hand, basically gives what we call a more ultimate and complete analysis of the existence of this phenomena. And for one thing, Buddhism emphasizes what we call the penetrative understanding of the nature of phenomena. And by this you will see how different the two of them are. For example, like before I've just said that a scholastic inquiry would tell you this is a table, and its name is a table, and it will talk about its functions and so on. But Buddhism, on the other hand, looks deeper into the existence of the table. Okay, this is called a table. Why do we call it a table? Where does the table come from? And what are the things that make up a table? And therefore, by explaining these, it gives you the truest nature of a table, which is also emptiness. And we'll talk about emptiness a bit later.